Welcome back to the Adams County Historical Society's Caught in the Crossfire series for the 158th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. We're here at a really special location with our historian, Tim Smith. We're at Evergreen Cemetery, just a little bit south of the town of Gettysburg. It was established in 1854, and thousands of local residents are buried here in this cemetery. We're going to talk, though, at this site about the family that lived in the Gatehouse, Elizabeth and her husband, Peter Thorne. What happened to them and their family during the battle, and Tim's going to give us a little background about the cemetery as well. So thanks for being with us. I hope you'll like the video and share it if you're watching, and I'll turn things over now to Tim to give us more about Evergreen Cemetery and the Thorne family.
So Evergreen Cemetery was established in 1854. The first burials were actually in November of 1854. In 1855, on September 1st, the cornerstone of the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse was laid, and it was completed that fall into early next spring, the next spring in 1856. And the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse is probably the most famous architectural feature associated with the battle. The day the cornerstone was laid, the church bells in the town were rung, and ironically, on that same exact day, Elizabeth Thorn and Peter Thorne were married. They had come to the United States from Germany in the 1850s. Elizabeth came with her parents, John and Catherine Masser. They moved to Gettysburg and they were married here. In 1856, Peter Thorne actually became the first superintendent of the Evergreen Cemetery, or the caretaker of the cemetery. Now, in 1862, Peter Thorne joined Company B, 138th Pennsylvania Infantry, and at the time of the battle, his unit was stationed in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on Maryland Heights. So he was not here at the time of the battle. A little known fact is Elizabeth Thorne's brother actually also served in Company B, 138th. So at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, Elizabeth Thorn was here, and she was acting as sort of the temporary caretaker while her husband was away in the Army. She lived here with her parents, as I stated, John and Catherine Masser, and also with her 3 children, Frederick, who was almost 7 at the time, George, who was almost 5, and the younger son, John, who was 2 at the time. Elizabeth Thorne, additionally, was 5 or 6 months pregnant at the time of the battle. And on November 1st, 1863, she gave birth to a child, Rosa Meade Thorne. And of course, a lot of people acknowledge the fact that the middle name of the child is in honor of the Army commander of the Union Army at the battle, General George Gordon Meade. A lesser known fact is that John, who was 2 years old at the time, John Thorne, actually later in life married Mia Meade Comfort, who was born on July 15th, 1863, downtown, and she is also named in honor of General George Gordon Meade. During the battle, on the evening of July 1st, the Union Army rallied on this hill. And of course, when the Northern Army took possession of Cemetery Hill, Elizabeth Thorne did what she could to feed the soldiers around the house. On the evening of July 1st, General Howard, and we're going to talk about General Sickles and Slocum, actually had a meeting in the house. On July 2nd, the family fled down the Baltimore Pike towards 2 taverns, and they returned on July 7th. And according to Elizabeth Thorne, when they returned, everything in the house was gone except 3 feather beds and a couple of pillows. The legs of 6 soldiers had been amputated on the beds in our house, and they were ruined with blood, and we had to make way with them. We found that 16 soldiers and 1 colored man had been buried in the garden near the pump house. In one field lay 15 horses, and in another 19 dead horses. They were right beside the cemetery and were not buried, and the stench was awful. For days, I could hardly eat because of the disagreeable odor. And of course, Elizabeth Thorn is a caretaker of the cemetery, and in the weeks afterwards, she buried some 90 soldiers in a very rocky section of the cemetery with the help of her sons and father. We'd like to thank Brian Kennel, the superintendent of the Evergreen Cemetery, for letting us have access to the cellar of the Gatehouse. Elizabeth Thorn, her father and mother, and her 3 children were in this cellar on July 1st, 1863. The children and her parents spent most of the day in the cellar. On the evening of July 1st, Elizabeth's attention was called by an aide of General Oliver Otis Howard. He decided to have a meeting here in the Gatehouse with General Sickles and General Slocum, and they asked Elizabeth to make a meal for them. Elizabeth didn't have much to make a meal with, so she made dough cakes, probably at this very fireplace. The meeting, which apparently was held upstairs in the main room of the house, we have an account of it from George Thorne. Now, he was almost 5 years old at the time, and he's recollecting this meeting in 1932, years later. And he says some of the interesting things that a kid might remember about the meeting. General Oliver Otis Howard arrived and requested permission to use a room in our house for consultation. His request was granted, and with General Sickles and General Slocum, they were in session until dark. We boys had the run of the house and invaded the consultation room at pleasure. We were much amused at the appearance of General Howard, whose right arm was amputated between the shoulder and elbow. He was of a nervous temperament and paced around the room back and forth in an excited manner, swinging his empty sleeves about, sometimes around his neck and over his head and back, but never quiet for a moment. So it was in this room that there would have been a consultation or a meeting between General Oliver Otis Howard, the commander of the 11th Army Corps, General Henry Warner Slocum, the commander of the 12th Army Corps, and Daniel Edgar Sickles, the commander of the 3rd Army Corps, according to the Thorne children, and of course, according to General Howard's reminiscence afterwards. They must have been discussing the situation at that time. The entire Northern Army was concentrating on Gettysburg. The Northern Army was solidifying its position on Cemetery Hill. And this is actually the mantle of the stove that is the fireplace that is downstairs, that is now preserved in this very room. We're standing in the Thorne family bedroom, or what would have been their bedroom at the time of the battle. Obviously, over the years, there have been several additions placed onto the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse, but this room remains the same, and the window is the same window that was here at the time. On the evening of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union Army rallied on Cemetery Hill. General Oliver Otis Howard ordered the larger stones in the cemetery to be set over on the ground so they wouldn't be damaged. But there were stones damaged during the battle. And today, as far as we are aware, there are 3 stones that show visible battle damage from the fighting in July of 1863. This is the grave of Frederick Huber. He was a member of the 23rd Pennsylvania Infantry, killed at the Battle of Fair Oaks. During the fighting, sometime on July 2nd or 3rd, an artillery shell struck his grave, and his father asked that it never be repaired. He was the son of Dr. Henry and Priscilla Huber, and they lived on Chambersburg Street in Gettysburg at the time of the battle. So this is the section of Evergreen Cemetery where Elizabeth Thorn, with a little bit of help, buried the 90 or so soldiers in July of 1863. Later, About 30 of them were removed to the new Soldiers National Cemetery, but about 60 of them are still here. Originally they had wooden headboards, and in the 1880s they were given government stones that you see here today. We're at the graves of Peter and Elizabeth Thorn. Peter was a caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery from 1856 until about 1875. The couple were married for more than 50 years, and when Peter died in January 1907, his wife Elizabeth died later that same year. And of course, also buried here in our cemetery is Rosa Meade Thorne, a child of Elizabeth that was born on November 1st, 1863.